Good evening, brave souls. I'm Grim, and tonight I'll be your companion through the shadows. Together, we'll dive into stories that grow darker with every whisper. So, get comfortable if you're ready. The night is only just beginning. Look what I found, Derek whispered, holding up a small golden amulet with intricate carvings. An image of the falcon-headed god, Horus, glinting in the dim light. The group of tourists, Derek, Lisa, Eric, and Maria, huddled around the artifact in the tomb. It was their last day in Egypt, and they had slipped away from the main tour to explore the hidden chambers. "Derek, put it back," Lisa warned, glancing nervously around. "They said not to touch anything." "Come on," Derek laughed, slipping it into his pocket. "It's just a little souvenir. No one will even notice." The others exchanged uncertain glances, but Derek shrugged off their concerns. They left the tomb, emerging into the blazing sun, ready to head back to the hotel and pack for their flight home. But as soon as they crossed the threshold, something changed. That night at the hotel, Derek was the first to notice something strange. As he lay in bed, a sharp, metallic scent filled the room. He tried to sit up, but an invisible weight pressed him down, holding him still. Suddenly, he saw shadows of robed figures surrounding his bed, chanting in a language he couldn't understand. He blinked, and the figures vanished. The next morning, Derek was pale, his usual swagger gone. I think I had a nightmare," he muttered, rubbing his temples as they met in the hotel lobby. But he didn't tell them about the robed figures. He thought it was his imagination playing tricks on him. They boarded their flight home, but as the plane took off, a gnawing unease settled over the group. Each felt the weight of the amulet Derek had taken, though none of them dared mention it. A week later, Eric's accident was the first. He was driving home late one night when his car swerved off the road. Later, he swore he had seen something. Shadowy figures standing in the middle of the street, their arms raised as if in ritual. His car spun, crashing into a ditch, but miraculously he survived with only a broken arm. "It wasn't normal," Eric told Lisa over the phone. "I felt like, I don't know, like they wanted me to get hurt." His voice trembled. Lisa didn't laugh or brush it off. She had her own nightmares, ones where she saw herself wrapped in linen, suffocating, trapped in darkness. And every morning she woke up with marks on her arms, red lines that looked like bindings. "Maybe we should get rid of it," she suggested to Derek, who still kept the amulet in his pocket, as if afraid to let it out of his sight. "It's just a coincidence," Derek replied, though his own face was ashen, and his nights were haunted by visions of ancient temples and priests performing blood rituals under a blazing sun. Days later, Maria had her turn. She was washing dishes in her apartment when she suddenly smelled smoke, sharp and suffocating, her kitchen filled with thick black fumes, though no fire was visible. Gasping, she stumbled outside, only to find her reflection in the glass door staring back at her, a twisted version of herself with eyes like burning coals. The visions left her shaken, her hands blistered from a burn that came from nowhere. She called Lisa, voice trembling. "I saw myself, Lisa, and it was like I was burning." Lisa's own fear had only grown. Every day she saw flashes of herself in ancient Egyptian scenes, kneeling before a priest, arms bound, or standing in front of an altar as sandstorms swirled around her. Each vision felt more real, more vivid, until she could barely tell where reality ended and the nightmare began. Finally, they agreed to meet, desperation driving them to seek answers. In a small cafe, they shared their experiences, each story darkening the mood until silence fell, thick and uneasy. "It's the amulet," Lisa said, voice barely above a whisper. "We took something that wasn't ours." "It's just a piece of metal," Derek insisted, though his hands shook as he pulled it out of his pocket, laying it on the table. The golden amulet gleamed, innocent in the cafe's dim light, yet the four friends could feel its weight, a cold presence that seemed to fill the room. Maria closed her eyes, remembering an ancient punishment she'd read about, how thieves in ancient Egypt were cursed, forced to endure the pain they inflicted upon others. She swallowed, her voice trembling. Maybe it's punishing us." Derek scoffed, but his laugh was hollow. "It's just our imaginations. We'll get rid of it, and this will all be over." Without another word, he grabbed the amulet and left the cafe, storming out into the cold night. The others watched him go, a mixture of hope and fear swirling in their eyes. That night, Derek felt the weight of something unseen pressing against him, colder and heavier than ever. He lay in bed, paralyzed, as visions flooded his mind. Images of himself kneeling before an altar, priests surrounding him, their faces hidden in shadow. Suddenly, he couldn't breathe. His throat constricted, as if invisible hands were squeezing it shut. He clawed at his neck, gasping, feeling his life slipping away. Then, just as quickly, the pressure released, leaving him shivering, drenched in sweat. He bolted upright, grabbing the amulet from his nightstand. Heart pounding, he stumbled outside, down the street, until he reached the banks of the river. Without hesitation, he hurled the amulet into the rushing water, watching it disappear beneath the surface. The nightmares stopped. One by one, Derek, Lisa, Eric, and Maria felt the weight lift. The visions faded. The strange marks on their bodies vanished, and the cold, shadowy presence that had haunted them finally seemed to let go. But none of them ever spoke about what happened again. The memory lingered in their minds like a dark stain, a reminder of the mistake they had made, the curse they had nearly unleashed upon themselves. Years later, Lisa returned to Egypt, this time careful to follow every rule, never straying from the main paths. But as she passed by the river, she felt an icy chill run through her, and her eyes fell on something glinting in the sand. Half buried on the riverbank, the amulet lay gleaming under the sun, as if waiting for its next owner. Lisa took a step back, heart pounding, before she turned and walked away, leaving the cursed artifact to the sands of Egypt, hoping that it would stay buried this time. But deep down, she knew some things were never truly meant to be left behind. They had warned Ben not to touch anything. Yet here he was, gripping the fragile statue of Anubis with both hands, captivated by its sleek jackal form. "It's just so cool," he murmured. But in that moment, his hands slipped. The statue fell, shattering against the dusty floor of the ancient tomb. Silence fell over the group of tourists. The guide's face turned pale, his voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have done that. Anubis is the guardian of the underworld." Ben swallowed, laughing nervously as he knelt to gather the pieces. But deep inside, a chill began to spread. Back in their Cairo hotel that night, the group tried to forget about the incident. They laughed and shared stories, convincing themselves that it was just an accident. Nothing more. But as midnight approached, something strange happened. Maria, one of the group members, suddenly froze, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The others stopped, listening intently. At first, there was only silence, thick and unnerving. Then a faint scratching sound echoed from the hall, soft yet insistent, like claws tapping against stone. "Probably just a stray dog," Ben muttered, though his voice was shaky. The group tried to laugh it off, but the mood had shifted. A strange unease settled over them, dark and suffocating. That night, they each lay in their hotel rooms, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. But none of them truly slept. The next morning, the group decided to explore Cairo's bustling markets, hoping the lively atmosphere would distract them. But as they wandered the narrow alleys, Ben caught sight of something strange, a shadowy figure, standing at the edge of his vision. It looked like a jackal, tall and lean, with glowing eyes that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He turned to his friends, pointing. "Do you see that?" Lisa squinted, scanning the crowd. "See what?" But when Ben looked back, the figure was gone. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, yet the strange sighting lingered in Ben's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. That night, the scratching returned, louder this time, echoing through the hotel's dimly lit hallways. Lisa sat up in bed, her heart pounding as she listened, the sound growing closer and closer. She tiptoed to the door, peeking through the peephole. Her breath caught in her throat. A dark shape stood in the hall, too large to be a dog. It had the sleek form of a jackal, its eyes glowing in the dim light. For a moment, its gaze met hers, cold and piercing. Then it turned and vanished down the hall. Lisa stumbled back, fear gripping her heart. She knew it couldn't be a real animal. No jackal would roam the halls of a Cairo hotel. But as she lay back down, the scratching continued, following her into her dreams. The next morning, Lisa told the group about her encounter, her face pale and drawn. Ben's expression hardened, a sense of dread settling over him. "I think it's because of the statue," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria gasped. "Are you saying we're being haunted by Anubis?" "It's a legend," Ben said, trying to sound brave. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Maybe we're just imagining things. Yet the group wasn't convinced. That day, as they explored the ancient city, the presence followed them, a shadow lurking just out of sight. Every corner they turned, every alley they walked, the figure appeared, sometimes as a flash of dark fur, sometimes as glowing eyes watching from the shadows. Their fear grew with each passing hour, a silent terror that none of them dared to voice. The feeling of being hunted was inescapable, and by nightfall they were exhausted, their nerves frayed. On their last night in Cairo, the group gathered in the hotel's small courtyard, too afraid to be alone. Shadows danced around them, cast by the flickering lanterns, and the night air was thick with tension. "I can't take this anymore," Maria whispered, her voice shaking. "I feel like we're being punished." Ben looked at her, guilt gnawing at him. Maybe it's the spirit of Anubis. The guide did say he guards the tombs, keeping away anyone who disrespects the dead. Lisa shivered, glancing nervously around the courtyard. "So what do we do? Apologize?" Ben took a deep breath, pulling the broken pieces of the statue from his bag. He hadn't been able to throw them away, something inside him unable to let go. "Maybe if we return these, the spirit will leave us alone." The next morning, they made their way back to the tomb. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the ancient stones as they retraced their steps, each step heavy with dread. They entered the tomb, the silence pressing down on them. Ben knelt by the spot where the statue had fallen, carefully placing the broken pieces on the ground. "We're sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. The group held their breath, fear and hope mingling in their hearts. Then a cold breeze swept through the chamber, rustling the ancient dust. Slowly they backed away, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over them. The weight that had haunted them for days lifted, leaving them feeling lighter, as though a dark cloud had finally passed. That night, they returned to the hotel, relieved and exhausted. For the first time in days, they felt safe. They laughed, sharing stories of their ordeal, each feeling as though they had finally escaped the nightmare. But as they prepared for bed, Ben glanced out the window, his heart freezing in his chest. There, in the shadows of the courtyard, stood the jackal figure, its eyes glowing with a cold, unwavering gaze. It hadn't left. It had only been waiting. One by one, each of them saw it, their laughter fading into silence as the realization dawned. The guardian of the underworld had followed them, not as a curse, but as a reminder. They had dared to disturb the ancient peace, and now they would be forever watched, marked by the gaze of Anubis. As they turned away, each felt a shiver, a final warning lingering in the darkness. And that night, when they closed their eyes, they knew they would see him in their dreams. The jackal, the guardian, the eternal watcher of those who dared to trespass on sacred ground. And as the darkness fades, remember, the real chills linger long after the story's end. Until next time, brave souls.